Welcome, everybody. My name is Jason. I'm one of the pastors here. Good to see you this morning. What is your most embarrassing moment? Really? Nobody? I have a few. I'm guessing you do too. None of mine actually compares with what I heard comedian Nate Bargatze share. Take a look.
To golf. And so I was sometimes bring clubs and I'll golf on the road. And so I was in Florida and we go golfing. It's very hot, humid, gross. You get kind of feeling gross. So I wanted to change shirts before I drove back. And I go to the trunk of my car and I take my shirt off, standing there, no shirt. And this old man walks up and goes, "Olivia?" I had to turn. I was like, "I'm sorry. What did you say?" I'm sorry. And he was like, "Oh, sorry. Honest mistake." And I was like, "I don't know." He was looking for his elderly wife and saw me with no shirt on and thought that could be Olivia. I had a car that he does not recognize. None of this is making him not. He's like, "I don't know. That's a dead ringer for Olivia." I don't know who he disrespected more, me or Olivia, to be honest. I mean, we could both have a word with him.
I would guess that everybody at some point has had an embarrassing moment, and that feels pretty innocuous, and maybe yours to somebody else's ears might feel the same. The problem is that they're not. Sometimes these things that happen, or maybe we say something to somebody else, and the impact of it is actually greater than we realize. And those words can sink in. Sometimes they come in the form of just something offhanded. Sometimes they have razor-sharp precision, and they cut deep because who they come from matters. A parent, a boss, even social media can trigger these things, and we internalize things that could it just be sort of, oh, well, things happen, or yeah, I feel bad about that, but life goes on. They run deeper, and they don't just settle for embarrassment. They don't just live as guilt. They turn into shame. Shame is a powerful thing in our world, and it's powerful a lot of times because we don't like to talk about it. We feel alone with the things that we're ashamed of. We think that somehow by keeping them to ourselves and putting a different image out there, that we're fooling everybody, that we're sort of better than we are. It's chronic in our culture, and I would hate for that to be the case here inside of these walls. We want to create a different narrative around here, not just to make everybody happy and feel good, but because we understand that God has a different intention for you than to live your entire life under the weight of guilt and shame. You have a better, more preferred future. And I believe that everybody who's listening, who's watching, wants to live without shame. That you want to live free. That you want to be authentic. That you don't want that to keep you from being the kind of person who's more open, who's more available in your relationships, in your work, just in your life. You don't want to have to keep the guard up all the time because it's exhausting and it's thin and it's fragile. And when I have the opportunity to present not just my way, but God's way as a better way, of course I want you to know that, because it is, in a very real sense, a key to freedom, the freedom we've been singing about, the freedom that we're going to hear about today through God's word. There is a problem. The problem is that we are susceptible to believing things that are not true about our worth. Somebody says something to us about our character, about who we are as a person, not just about a deed, and we take that to heart. We read something, or we're not getting that itch scratched in the places that we need to, or we sort of begin identifying ourselves with what we have or don't have, and we begin to believe that's who we are. That our health is who we are, that how many likes we have is who we are. And when we have an expectation and we don't meet that, somehow we feel a certain way about who we are, about our worth, about our value. We feel unloved. We feel unaccepted. We feel like life is not worth living because of these things that we don't have, that we sort of measured our worth and our value by. And the problem is we're listening to the wrong voices, even amongst people who mean well and some that don't. When we believe those lies and we're not taking what God says about us first and foremost, that's the problem. Dr. Brené Brown is an author that I read quite a bit and use in my work and practice. She cuts to the heart of the difference between guilt and shame and how it impacts men and women differently. I want to take a look and listen to what she has to say.
Shame is the gremlin who says, never good enough. And if you can talk it out of that one, who do you think you are? The thing to understand about shame is it's not guilt. Shame is a focus on self. Guilt is a focus on behavior. Shame is I am bad. Guilt is I did something bad. Shame is highly, highly correlated with addiction, depression, violence, aggression, bullying, suicide, eating disorders. And here's what you even need to know more. Guilt inversely correlated with those things. Shame for women is this web of unattainable, conflicting, competing expectations about who we're supposed to be. For men, shame is not a bunch of competing, conflicting expectations. Shame is one. Do not be perceived as what? Weak.
So even though they present differently, what we need to hear is there actually is a common thread, and it has to do with the fact that both of those voices of shame put you at the center. You are sort of the ultimate authority in deciding who you are. Nowhere in the Bible is that confirmed. We're not going to see it anywhere. We're going to hear and see something very different as we look at Scripture. And this is the good news, because there is a better way. It's not just a self-help, hey, TED Talk and off we go. This is life transformation stuff, because it gets at the core not just of who you are, but who says who you are and what that is supposed to mean, and the process of not just getting rid of shame, but working with it, dealing with it, addressing it, and then being free from it. Because the life you want, I believe, is on the other side of those voices and what God says you are and who you are and the price that's been paid and the process of getting through that. Because it is not easy. It requires some things of us that if you'll have the courage today and have the faith to look those things in the eye, when you look in the mirror, you're going to see something different than maybe you have before. When you step on the scale, when you read your emails, when you, whatever, you're going to be reminded over and over and over again of who God says you are. And that is what I hope makes all the difference. Proverbs 9 helps us understand it this way. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom, and the knowledge of the Holy One is understanding. We start with God at the center because He's the one who frames the rest of our understanding about who we are. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. And for some of you, that's the whole message right there, is because you're starting from someplace else and hoping to get where you want to go. The writer of Proverbs says, no, the understanding of who God is in all of this is the building block upon which the rest of it is built. So we start there and allow His voice, His truth, to speak to us, to recalibrate us, to redefine who we are, why we're here, what our purpose is, what the other voices in our life are meant to do, and which things we need to be able to tune out, block out, let go of, and not allow to seep in, and to continue to build the walls of shame in our life, that we can be free from those things. God's big idea for today addresses this very thing. And it comes in the form of an antidote to shame, and it's this: God's grace on the inside leaves you with nothing to hide. That word feels funny in society's mouth these days. Grace? No, too good to be. How can somebody be that generous, that kind, that giving to somebody who doesn't deserve? How in the world could I receive something like that? It feels like it should have "as seen on TV" written by it. It's just, okay, where's the strings? There's got to be a catch, Am I going to get added to somebody's email list? Am I going to start getting phone, what is it to have God's grace on the inside? And how is it that that makes me somehow able to live this kind of authentic life? Well, that's what we're going to look at. We're going to look at it in 3 phases today. And we're going to start with something that's very uncomfortable, but it is the hinge point for where we need to go. We got to start with sin. We got to start with sin. And you say, wait a minute, I thought we were talking about shame. And why can't we first talk about that awful thing my dad always said, or my boss, or that hateful, nasty gram I got? Why don't we start with those people and how God's going to wipe those people? No. We have to start with sin because it is the universal human condition. We all live under the effects, the weight, the severity of sin. We all do, not just the bad people. We all live under that. Genesis chapter 2, we read the story of Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden, naked as jaybirds. Why? Because the weather permitted it? No, because they weren't ashamed. They had no shame. There wasn't any because there was no sin. There was no sin. As soon as that changed, as soon as they were tempted and they chose their way instead of God's way, what happened to them? Their eyes were opened and they realized, whoops. And then we get all the artwork with the well-positioned fig leaves and all that, And what did God do? God chose to kill an animal so that they would have clothes to wear. God made the first move right in the very first story in the Bible to cover their shame. But that's where the story begins. And unfortunately, spoiler alert, we all live with the repercussions of their choice. Would we have done the same thing? Probably. So we can't just go, Adam and Eve. We can't just keep blaming outside of this, hoping shame will go away, because shame is rooted in sin, whether we gave it to somebody else or whether we have taken it on board ourselves. See, here's where shame is so insidious. It turns a deed into an identity. You felt that? Oh, I got in this dumb thing. I'm an idiot. Have you ever told yourself that? It's a really easy jump for a lot of people who are already kind of open to those voices to say, oh, yeah, if you did this, if you've ever done time in jail, do you want to be known the rest of your life as your worst day? Is that what you want to be known as? Is that really your identity? No, that's the voice of shame telling you that thing you did, that regrettable thing, or that thing that person, that is now your identity. Not true. Not true. But there is room for shame. The prophets, as you read in the Old Testament, some of the sketchier parts that oftentimes are a little harder to understand, but at their core, people that God spoke to speak to a group of people, much like I'm speaking to you today, to say, hey, you're off track. The people of Israel wandered away from God. God had to sort of recalibrate them, and sometimes it involved exile, sometimes it meant punishment or defeat in battle, to wake them up to their misdeeds and to introduce a measure of shame, but not as the final piece to the story, to bring them back to something. Yes, Israel, you should be ashamed. Your deeds are terrible. You're making horrible moral life decisions for yourselves. You are acting unwisely in your own life, and you're treating people unjustly. Those were the two things God calls out over and over and over again in these things, but not as the end result. That's not the end of the story. God made a covenant with people who follow him and says, I will never leave you. I will never forsake you. But boy, do we have some work to do along the way. So there is room for feeling bad about things, but not as the end of the story. See, shame that you feel, any shame that you feel, help me out, Charles. There we go. Any shame you feel from the effects of sin is meant to lead you to rebirth, not resignation. Anything we feel like that's like, oh, I'm such a terrible whatever, or this person said this, and so I must be, and oh, I did this awful thing, and so therefore, that's not the end of your story, not in God's economy. Those things are meant to lead you to a place of rebirth, to say, God, I'm broken. God, I need help. I can't fix this. I feel like I'm believing a lie, but I don't know any better. That's the place where God wants to be involved in rebirth. because God has never given up on you and never will. He promises to never, ever leave or forsake you. And you may shake your head at that and say, well, where was God when this? Where was God during the abuse? Where was God when this awful thing happened? He's right here. And you don't have to like that. You can question that all you want, but you cannot deny the fact that that is not the end of your story. There is a place for rebirth, for new life, for a life free from shame. Dr. Brown calls this understanding your vulnerabilities. Well, guess what our vulnerability is in the life of faith? It is sin. And it is way worse than you think. We treat sin, Pastor Adam had a picture of a scale up here recently, and I was thinking about that because we tend to, and a lot of people that you know, that you work with, that you live with, tend to treat sin as like, we just balance out the good with the bad. Oh, no. The Bible does not confirm that either. Look what it says. Ephesians 2, verse 1. As for you, you were... Oh, no, you don't sound convinced. As for you, you were dead in your transgressions and sins. That sounds pretty severe. We tend to grade mistakes as sort of this or this, and sin sort of has, that's a really bad one. No, it's all, it's all sin. And sin, the ultimate consequence is death, spiritual death, physical death as a result. That's the state we live in. We have to get honest about that and not look outside of ourselves and not pour the weight of the world on our own shoulders and say, this is because God has taken care of sin. And we're going to look at how that happened too. 1 Corinthians chapter 6, verse 20. Here's the redemption. You are not your own. You were bought with a price. Shame says, I'm unworthy, I'm unlovable, nobody could accept me if only they knew. And God says, I know everything about you, because I made you, and I love you more than anyone else on earth ever will, and I have reclaimed you. You are not your own. God puts himself at the center of the equation and says, you're not going to escape shame without me. Without me first, without understanding what I've done for you. And you're going to have to lean into that. But you also have to raise your hand and say, I have sinned. And because of that, I am in the need of help. And that's the hardest part for most people because that's not how we work in the US of A. We kid ourselves into thinking that, if I have enough money, if I know the right people, if I go to these places, if I am networked, all these things, that I can insulate nothing will insulate you from the damning effects of sin. Only the work that God has come to do. Second thing we got to lean into, though, is to come clean in community. When we address the sin state in our life, we have to come clean. We have to. There's a reason that we're just this side of pleading with everybody to get in a small group. Not a group of 80 or 90 people, but people who you can lean in a little bit to come clean in community. And that makes heart rates go up. That makes palms sweat because that is not how we do things most of the time. We want to project a different persona. Everything's all ironed out. I don't have problems. I don't have a history. I don't whatever. But that's not how it works. Dr. Brown has this to say about the effects of shame and how vulnerability addresses that. Shame needs 3 ingredients to grow exponentially. Secrecy, keep it to yourself. Silence, don't speak up about those things. And judgment. Well, if I put it out there, people are going to think different of me, and I can't have that. Never mind the fact that if you look around even in just this room, you're in very good company because that's where we're all at. We're all susceptible to that. But by contrast, she says this about vulnerability. Vulnerability is having the courage to show up and be seen when you have no control over the outcome. And that's really scary because every one of us can think of a time probably when you have put yourself out there and you've been burned and you have been judged and you have been unfriended and you have been fired and you have been whatever. And that can create walls that say never again, not going to do that again. But it's not an option, folks. It is the price of doing business. We have to be able to come clean in community. And vulnerability is the key. But here's what else I want you to think about vulnerability, and particularly with guys, since Dr. Brown talked about weakness. We hear this: vulnerability isn't weakness. It's not. If I, tell a story and it makes me cry, then somehow I'm less of a, what? No. It's not weakness. It is a risk. It is a risk that requires courage and faith, because you do not know how it's going to go. That's why we put such a priority in small groups on confidentiality. We hold things in confidence so that there's a measure of safety to open up and risk the idea that and especially in the context of Christian community where we share not always like beliefs, but like faith. We're on the same journey. There's an understanding that I've got my stuff and you've got your stuff, and by sharing that openly with somebody, you might hold that in confidence, you might receive that, you might show empathy and saying, yeah, me too. Not maybe necessarily your exact struggle, but I've had things that have made me feel that way too. People who will pray for you, who will encourage you, who will hold that trust. I see it all of the time as I learn about different stories. People who I know are in community together, and there's just a look. There's a way of being around each other that tells me that they're doing that work. I see it in myself too. Just not only on Sundays, but in the time in between, the people who are checking in on me and I'm checking in on them. There's a shared understanding that we're all in process, but we have to be able to come clean in community. Yes, do business with God. Of course, the forgiveness is there. The grace is there. We're going to see that in Hebrews chapter 4. Let us approach God's throne of grace with what? Confidence, so that we may receive mercy and find grace to help us in our time of need. And that's the beauty of it, is your confession. Help me out, Charles. Boom, your confession will always be met with God's compassion and grace. No conditions, no restrictions, always met with that, which means that all your mistakes now serve a purpose instead of serving shame. God can use that part of your story and redeem it and give you a different story. He did that with Paul in 1 Corinthians chapter 15. Paul says it this way, very candid about his own life. He says, I am the least of the apostles and do not even deserve to be called an apostle, because I persecuted the church of God. Now, he could have allowed that to ruin his entire life. But listen, but by the grace of God, I am what I am. And his grace to me is not without effect. Paul had all the reason in the world to let the pendulum swing one of two ways, to say, I had it all figured out. Yeah, I killed a few Christians, but I'm fine. No. He said, yeah, I had those things, but I also killed Christians. And oh boy, my life should just be in the toilet by now. And he says, no, by God's grace, I am what I am. And his grace to me is not without effect. Went to a funeral here a couple weeks ago. The deceased, young mom, kids at home, just, the heartbreak of all of that, personal connection. And when a person is eulogized, maybe you've seen this or had to speak like this on behalf of a person, sometimes the things we don't want to talk about actually come out. You have to be careful with that, sensitive. You're not trying to out somebody and all that stuff, but a lot of times those people give voice to things that may have been sort of low on the radar, that nobody wanted to talk about, but that's the perfect time to talk about them. And the person who got up and spoke did a beautiful thing. She talked about this young mom who had her own struggles and who dared to risk coming clean in community, to talk about the things that were very difficult for her, to share that struggle with like-minded people of faith who would encourage her and pray for her and all these things. And she said there was a key conversation she had as she was working through that process. She said, you know what? I used to have a secret, and now I have a story. You see the difference? I can see in your eyes some of you want that so bad, but you have to get through the keeping the secret part. Because that's where shame lives, is with those secrets, with that, that fear that keeps us. That's why courage is required. That's why faith is not just in yourself, but in God is required to say, God, I believe that you want something better for me. I'm going to have to do my part to lean in and trust that God puts people in our path who are his hands and feet, his heart, his ears, his warmth, his love, his acceptance. Now, if you've ever gone out on a bad date, I did. Sometimes I was the bad date. You're laughing. I don't get that. Did you quit dating? No. Small groups can be like that. Not every group is going to just be like, don't quit dating just because it didn't click the first. Don't quit serving just because it didn't click the first time. If I've never shot a bow and arrow and I try and, string up, of course I'm probably not going to hit the target. I may not hit anything. But as I adjust, then it becomes a little, that's the kind of work. This community is a work in progress. And it takes your whole life. I know people old enough to be my parents and beyond who still are committed to this process. And I can tell you the vitality that comes along with putting yourself in this position, clinical and otherwise, makes a huge difference in your quality of life, in the level of confidence that you experience, in the shame elimination, in your ability to move forward with a sense of joy and meaning and purpose and not be saddled down with things that sometimes people keep secret for a very long time. They improve the quality of your life and give you the hope and the optimism and the forward look and the ability to invest in relationships around you that other people don't have the energy to support because they're too worried about keeping their stuff all together. Am I preaching to anybody here? Okay. I'm telling you the difference. There's research to back this up now, but I would like for you to just kind of lean into it because it's what is possible for you. Last point here, and we'll sing and we'll get done. We're supposed to count on the cross. Coming clean isn't where we're just supposed to have this catharsis and then just lay in a puddle and go, oh, well, that's it. Just leave me for dead. No. There's redemption in that. Not just because of other people accepting it, but because of the grace that God extends, working together, and not just as a one-time deal to say, oh, boy, I'm glad I had that tough conversation. Now let me get back to whatever. No. We cling to the cross all the way. Some of you grew up maybe like I did. I will cling to the old rugged cross and exchange it someday for a crown. It's not meant to be a one-time thing, and then we go off on our own again. The cross and the work of the cross, the sacrifice that Jesus made once and for all for the sins of humanity, his death, his resurrection, his defeat for forever and all time over sin and shame and death is meant to be our identifier for the rest of our lives. We are not our own. We've been bought with a price. And so there is this balancing act of saying, yes, I am not perfect on my own, but I'm not defined by my imperfections. I'm defined by redemption. I'm defined by who God says I am. Yes, the world may not understand or even like that, but that is my story. Clinically, Dr. Brown would say that is something called shame resilience. In our life of faith, I would call it assurance. It's very hard to quantify, but it's very palpable, and it's the kind of thing you know it when you got it, and you know it when you don't. It's the kind of thing that begs not explanation, but demonstration. It's something that we're meant to live out, to live in, to be like Paul. He wasn't just some spiritual elite that, I can never get. He was just a guy who messed up and found God's grace to be true and effective in his life. It's something that we all can have and walk in the assurance of faith that God is who God says he is, and we are who God says he says we are. 1 Corinthians 1, longer passage here, and we'll wrap up. The message of the cross is foolishness. We talk about it all of the time, and it's never going to change. It's how we identify as a community. But it's foolishness to those who are perishing, but to us who are being saved, it is the power of God. God chose the foolish things of the world to shame the wise. God chose the weak things of the world to shame the strong. He keeps going. God chose the lowly things of this world and the despised things so that no one may boast before him. It's because of him, always, the cross, the empty tomb, that you are in Christ Jesus, who has become for us the wisdom from God. That is our righteousness, holiness, and redemption. And he closes with this. Therefore, as it is written, let the one who boasts boast in the Lord. If we have any swagger in life, it's not because of our ability to bail ourselves out of an eternal indictment. It is because of what Jesus has done for you and me. I wish I had more of that confidence. I wish I had more of that vibrato. Sometimes I just have to see it played out and hear it from somebody who I think represents it well. Now, who I'm about to show you is not up for sainthood anytime soon, but I want you to see what it might look like in your life. Take a look.
What about me would make you think that I care about your opinion of me? Your opinion of me is not the opinion that I have of myself. You ain't make me, so you can't break me. You didn't build me, so you can't kill me. You know what? God established me, so you ain't nothing you can do to me.
God established me, so there ain't nothing you can do to me. Now, you don't have to wear, sunglasses and root for Colorado to have that. And if you're an Oregon fan, you're grateful. Here's the deal. Dr. Brown finishes one of her speeches with this. She says, owning your story can be hard. Coach Prime has a story. It's been interesting to study his film recently, but not nearly as difficult as spending your life running from it. There's a great story in 2 Samuel about King David, who brings the Ark of the Covenant back from being stolen, basically. And the way I read the passage is he strips down to his underwear and he starts dancing. He's so happy about it. He just can't stop from dancing. And his wife kind of goes, oh, honey, put your clothes back on. You're embarrassing. He goes, what? Don't you realize what God has done for me, for us? I'll be even more undignified than this. I don't care. God has done a work in my life. And I got to thinking about that. I'm like, what's better? Running or dancing? Which would you rather do? Which would you rather spend the rest of your life pursuing? Running from something that everybody has in common anyways, or finding release from shame, from a hold that those labels and everything can have on your life and saying, no. God says, I am more. God says, I am dearly loved, that I have inherent value, that I was loved before the creation of the world, that he has plans and designs for me that I can't even put my head around, not because I'm so special, but because he's so good. And yes, he may cause me to come through some things, but those chapters aren't the whole story, and they're certainly not the end of the story. God has a better future. He wants me to live free, and it's going to be tough sledding to get there, I know, but by faith, I'm going to take a step. I'm going to take a step because I cannot live with the shame anymore. It drives people to really tragic ends, I will tell you that. And when we're free from it, it leads to whole new outcomes. Some of you are living proof of that, and you inspire me in ways you cannot believe, because I've been there too. The shame that I have felt at certain points in my life almost caused me to make terrible life decisions that probably could have ended my life. And by God's grace, I have a different story. And some of you have that too, and you've been willing to share that, to receive that in groups of people who will hear that, who will understand that. You can encourage one another. That's the beauty of all of this. Who wouldn't want that? Who wouldn't want that? Will you take the risk? I'm going to ask you to stand. We're going to sing as a response, not to just take up more time, but we believe that there's room for response as we hear what God is saying through his word. We want you to sit with that for a little bit. You're not missing that much football, trust me. Fourth quarter is all that matters. What if your story had a new beginning today? And God wanted to be a part of that because finally the message is getting through. I put him at the center. Let's sing about that, and we'll close.